2017. In a cornfield outside of Papillion, Nebraska, an architect and urban designer built a neighborhood that quietly started a revolution. His name was Daniel Paralek. And to understand Nashville's next chapter, we have to start in Nebraska. If you were standing on that cornfield 20 years ago, you wouldn't have seen much. A 2-lane road, a lake in the distance, big sky. The kind of quiet that makes you think nothing important has ever happened there. But if you go back to that same spot today, it's different. You see front porches and tree-lined streets, people walking dogs, kids on bikes, a couple carrying takeout back from the corner shop. You see buildings that look like big houses, until you realize each one holds 3 or 4 or 6 homes. And if you squint, if you ignore the Nebraska plates, you could convince yourself you're in one of those old streetcar suburbs American cities stopped building after World War II. This place has a name. It's called Prairie Queen. On 50 acres, Daniel Paralek and his team built an entire neighborhood of what most American zoning codes refused to build. Fourplexes and sixplexes that read like large houses. Townhomes and mansion apartments. Cottage courts wrapped around shared greens. Over 500 units. All house scale, as Paralek calls it. All walkable. All a little bit familiar if you've ever walked through an older neighborhood where buildings don't match the zoning map. And something unexpected happened. It sold out. People wanted to live like that, where you can walk to a park, bump into neighbors, and buy something smaller. More attainable than a big single-family house. Not a special program unit, just the kind of place a teacher or a nurse on a normal salary could afford without leaving town. Prairie Queen is what happens when somebody like Daniel Paralek looks at a gap between the single-family house and the big apartment building and decides to build in it. And he has a name for that gap. He calls it the missing middle. Missing middle housing is his label for all of the house-sized buildings that quietly hold more than one home in a walkable neighborhood. The duplex that looks like one big house from the street. The fourplex that's wrapped with a deep front porch. The little cluster of cottages around a courtyard. The kinds of buildings that make a neighborhood feel full and alive, without ever feeling like a high-rise. The concept isn't new. American cities built it for almost a century. From the 1800s through the 1940s, then modern zoning made it effectively illegal. What Paralek did was give it a name and a picture. He shifted the conversation from density, which scares people, to something simpler. House-scale buildings with more doors. Same outcome, completely different mental image. In this final episode, Daniel Paralek is going to be our guide. Prairie Queen is our starting point, and the question we're going to ask is simple. If a suburb outside of Omaha can build missing middle on purpose, what would it take for Nashville to stop growing by loophole and start growing by design? Before we answer that, we have to start with something uncomfortable. Before we talk about what Nashville could build next, we have to be honest about what we didn't build. Because if Prairie Queen is a neighborhood made out of missing middle housing, Nashville, by comparison, is a city built almost entirely without it. I picture Nashville's housing like a ladder. At the bottom rung is a single-family house, 1 unit per structure. 2 houses on one lot, if you use the Horizontal Property Act. And at the very top of the ladder, we have the towers. Downtown high-rises, or large-scale apartment buildings. 200, 300 units stacked on top of parking decks and amenity floors. And in between those rungs, blank space. That middle rung, the triplexes, the fourplexes, the cottage courts with 3 or 4 homes facing a shared green space, each with its own front door, that whole category is mostly missing. Not just missing in a sense that we didn't get around to it. Missing in the sense that for most of the city, it's effectively illegal to build at all. And here's why that matters. Missing middle housing sits in a sweet spot. There's more homes than a single-family house, fewer than a large apartment building, cheaper per unit because you share land and walls, but the structure is familiar enough to sit comfortably on a normal neighborhood lot. When you erase that middle rung, you're not just changing the skyline. You're deciding who can afford a set of keys on the street at all. A triplex on a standard Nashville lot doesn't need a parking garage. It doesn't cast a shadow over the whole block. From the street, it can look honestly pretty ordinary. It just quietly holds more neighbors. But we didn't build that missing rung. Instead, we built something else. If you listen to episode 2, you know the story. You know the loophole. An attorney general's opinion on the Horizontal Property Act from 1963 said you could put 2 homes on one lot and no subdivision was required. Developers read that sentence, they saw the gap, and they optimized for it. But if you want to build a triplex in Nashville, 3 units, the city treats it as multifamily, a massive hurdle anywhere zoned R. That required cost, time, complexity. But 2 units, 2 fee simple-ish HPRs on one lot, technically not subdividing, faster, cheaper, easier. So developers did the math. They could build tens of thousands of units using one clean, legal pathway. Or they could fight zoning to try to build a triplex. They chose the path of least resistance. And honestly, who can blame them? The system incentivized it. The result was over 20,000 units of one type, HPRs. Not variety, not a ladder with lots of rungs, just one dominant form, the 2-on-1, tall and skinny. The loophole didn't just shape what got built, it shaped what didn't. Nashville never really experimented with that middle rung. We just jumped straight from 1 house per lot to 2 big HPRs per lot. And then from there, up to the mid-rise and high-rise downtown. And over time, the choice shows up in prices. If the only new thing you ever build on a lot is a pair of expensive HPRs, you've silently decided that anyone who can't clear that bar has to look somewhere else. In Nebraska, Prairie Queen is what happens when you ask, what if we filled that missing rung on purpose? To find out what it would take in Nashville, we're going to study the places that tried it first. We're going to go through 3 case studies so you can see other cities that have tried, what's working, and what Nashville can do next. First stop, Nebraska. Prairie Queen is what it looks like when you decide we're going to build the middle rung on purpose. Not as a one-off duplex, not as a rogue fourplex someone snuck through the code. An entire neighborhood made out of missing middle buildings. Nothing taller than 3 stories, no podium garages, no giant parking lots, no there goes the neighborhood moment. If you walk the block, you start to realize what's actually going on. That big house on the corner, it's not a house. It's a mansion apartment. 1 building, 6 homes. That cute cottage over the garage, that's a carriage house. That row along Main Street, those are townhomes and live-work units. Run a business downstairs and live upstairs. Every building is doing the same trick. Look like a house, function like a multiplex. And here's the important part for us. This didn't happen by accident. Papillion did the opposite of what Nashville did with HPRs. Instead of saying, sure, you can maybe get a triplex if you fight through zoning commission, they said on this piece of land, the rules are going to be different and simpler if you build the thing we say we want. They wrote site-specific code for Prairie Queen. A clear street plan that was narrow, tree-lined streets, alleys, on-street parking, and pre-approved palette of building types, duplexes, fourplexes, mansion apartments, townhomes, carriage houses. And a simple deal. If you stick to the kit of parts and the design palette, your project is basically by right. No rezoning for every phase, no design fight on every corner. It was certainty. They also use the engineering tools. Streets are narrower, parking is tucked in alleys or on the curb. The streets become public, so the developer isn't stuck owning some giant private road. From a pro forma standpoint, Prairie Queen performs like a luxury suburban apartment complex. But from the street, it reads like a normal neighborhood. But Prairie Queen is not a one-to-one Nashville comparable. Nashville's not a plot of dirt that we can just mold from scratch. Most of Prairie Queen is rental. It's not ownership. It's not a metro. But as a first case study, it answers the question we keep dancing around. What happens if you stop sprinkling in missing middle and instead build an entire neighborhood out of it? You get a coherent place that feels like a neighborhood. You get densities that can support parks and corner shops. And you get a product that renters clearly want because people leased it up immediately. The learning from Nashville is to steal the structure, not the setting. One clear code, a set of missing middle building types, faster approvals if you play by the rules. And where Papillion mostly stopped at rentals, Nashville could take it a step further and bake in ownership. Prairie Queen is the control experiment. The point isn't that we'll copy Prairie Queen building for building, it's that we can copy the rules that made missing middle housing the easy default move instead of the exception. Our next two case studies show what happens when you try to inject missing middle into an already messy big city, something that looks a lot more like Nashville. If Prairie Queen is the lab experiment on a blank 50-acre canvas, Portland, Oregon is the first stress test in a real city. With all the politics, all the inertia, all the please don't ruin my neighborhood energy, Nashville knows very well. And Portland proves something uncomfortable. When you stop making missing middle illegal, developers don't shrug. They run at it. For decades, most of Portland's single-dwelling land looked a lot like RR zones, 1 or 2 houses per lot. A few garage apartments around the edges, but the basic deal was the same as Nashville. In 2020, Portland passed the Residential Infill Project, RIP, I call it RIP. On paper, the idea was simple. In low-density zones, you can now build duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and in some income-restricted, sixplexes, where you used to only be able to build one house. And they did one crucial thing. They put a hard cap on how big the building can be based on the unit count. Before RIP, you could scrape a bungalow in an R zone and come back with a 6,000 plus square foot ego house on a standard 5,000 square foot lot. After RIP, the city draws a box around that and says, if you build one house, the box tops out at 2,500 square feet. But if you build more units, a duplex, a triplex, the box can get bigger, up to 3,000 or 3,500 square feet, or even 4,000 square feet if you keep an old house and add an affordable unit. On the ground, it did something subtle. You can stand on a single-family street in Portland and look down the block. There's a big one-unit house built before RIP, 4,000, sometimes 5,000 square feet. Next door is a brand new building that doesn't look any bigger from the sidewalk. Same height, same basic box, same roof line. From the curb, they read the same. But inside that new box, it's not one family stretching out over 4,000 square feet. It's 4 front doors, 4 smaller houses, 4 households in the same footprint that used to be a single address. And if you're hearing that and thinking, does that mean nobody can build a big house in Portland anymore? Not exactly. If you already live in a big house, you can keep it. You can renovate it, fix the kitchen, add a bedroom. What RIP really changes is the next teardown. Instead of rewarding small house out, one giant house in, the code now quietly rewards small house out, several smaller homes in the same basic box. That one flip changes incentives. The builder's question stops being how big can I make one unit? And it becomes how many smaller units can I fit in this envelope and still hit my numbers? So the natural question is what actually got built? Once the new rules went into effect in 2020, the city started tracking what happened, and the before and after is stark. Historically, those single-family dwelling zones only produced about 10 to 20% of Portland's new housing in any given year. After RIP, they jumped to the 20s and 40%. To the point where, in some recent periods, almost half of all new housing permits were happening in areas that used to be one door per lot. And the mix changed. Before RIP, new construction in those zones was mostly single-family homes. After RIP, detached houses dropped to 20% of new units. The rest was missing middle. plexes, clusters, and small stuff that would have been illegal a few years earlier. So you get this clear pattern. Before you scrape one house, build one big. After you scrape one house and build 4 smaller ones. The city didn't force anyone to do that. They just changed the math so that the multiple smaller units become the better play for developers. Portland created a housing report to analyze what actually got built after RIP. The most common thing that emerged is weirdly specific. A 2-bedroom, 900 square foot, for sale home. Usually a fourplex, with at least a small porch, yard, or patio. Nobody wrote that into code. Developers just converged on it. It's the Goldilocks unit. Big enough for a couple, roommates, or a small family. Small enough that the price can come down. Efficient enough that 4 of them can sit comfortably on a standard city lot. Visually, it's a totally different outcome than Nashville's Tall and Skinnies. Same market forces, different rules, different building forms. When the city looked at sales of new construction in those zones, they found a few things. New missing middle units, those plexes and cottage houses, were selling for $250,000 to $300,000 less than a detached houses in the same neighborhoods. Not because they're some massive subsidy, but because they're smaller and they share land. With some targeted low-income programs layered in, the price gap got even bigger. The point isn't the exact numbers, it's the geometry. There's more units per lot, smaller homes per household, and lower sticker prices per front door. Affordability by geometry, not by slogan. Portland didn't just stop at you can build more units. They created a way to actually own them. They invented something called the Middle Housing Land Divisions, an expedited way to split the lot under a fourplex or a cottage cluster into separate fee-simple parcels. 4 lots, 4 houses, 4 mortgages. Sound familiar? The result was a huge share of those new missing units are now under their own lots, not locked inside a condo stack. They had to pass a whole new legal mechanism to do that, and this is where Nashville has an advantage. We've had a version of that power for decades. It's called the horizontal property regime. We've been casually doing fee-simple-ish splits without slicing up the dirt since the early 2000s. And we use that flexibility to create 2-on-1s in Green Hills, Tall and Skinnies in the Nations, duplex after duplex after duplex, all without touching the underlying parcels. In other words, the tool that Portland had to invent is something we've already baked into our development DNA. We were just pointed at the wrong building types. Instead of a 2-bedroom, 900 square foot fourplex unit, we used HPRs to build 3,000 square foot Siamese mansions, 2 luxury homes where there used to be 1 modest house. Same legal structure, totally different outcome. The Portland lesson for Nashville isn't to copy the code for word. It's a few key things. First, to cap the size of what can get on an R lot and match the neighborhood. Second is to open the door to triplexes, fourplexes, and cottage courts in default forms, and to aim our existing HPR tool at those forms instead of only allowing for 2 luxury units. We don't need a brand new statute to get 4 modest homes where a bungalow sits today. We already have the mechanism. What we're missing is the direction. Prairie Queen showed us what a whole missing middle neighborhood feels like. Portland shows us how existing neighborhoods change when you finally let the missing rung onto the ladder, and that there's demand for it. Next, we're going to look at a city that feels a lot like Nashville on paper, and decided to pull the missing middle lever from the top down. Our final case study takes us back to the West Coast, Sacramento, California. At first glance, Sacramento and Nashville seem nothing alike. Different coasts, different politics, different stereotypes. But zoom out and they're weirdly similar. Both are state capitals anchoring metro areas around 2 to 2.5 million people. Both sit on economics built around government, healthcare, and education, with a growing layer of tech and logistics. Both have watched home prices and rents sprint ahead of wages over the last 15 years. In other words, it's 2 mid-sized capitals living parallel lives. Sacramento just decided to do something about housing a little sooner. And the city brought in Daniel Paralek, the same architect who named the missing middle and built Prairie Queen. His firm worked with Sacramento on a simple idea. Instead of counting units, regulate form. Make the shape of the building the thing you care about, not how many front doors it has. Because once you fix the shape, whether it's 1 unit or 4 inside, matters a lot less to the neighbors that walk past. Sacramento's missing middle housing interim ordinance was adopted unanimously by the city council on September 17, 2024, making Sacramento the first city in California to allow multi-unit housing in all single-family neighborhoods. Sacramento's missing middle housing ordinance uses a tool called the floor area ratio, or FAR. Think of it this way. FAR is a ratio between how big a lot is and how much building you're allowed to put on it. The sliding scale flips incentives. Similar to Portland, developers get more allowable square footage for building more units. Here's the beautiful simplicity. If you build 1 unit on a lot, you get a low FAR ratio, a smaller total building. If you build multiple units, you unlock a higher FAR, a larger total building, as long as it still fits the heights and the form rules. Here's a concrete example. Let's say you own a lot that's 50 feet wide and 150 feet deep. That's 7,500 square feet of land. With a FAR ratio of 0.4, which is the max for 1 unit, you can build up to 3,000 square feet of building. So that's roughly 1,500 square feet per floor if you're building a single family unit. But if you increase the amount of units on the lot, your ratio goes up to 1 and sometimes even more. So you can build 7,500 square feet of building. That could be 2 or 3-story buildings split into several smaller homes. So on a typical city lot, your choice looks something like this. 1 big house, smaller total envelope. Or several smaller homes, larger envelope, more sellable, and more rentable square footage. The ordinance doesn't promise that every developer will suddenly build fourplexes, but it quietly shifts the math so that more smaller homes often pencil out better than 1 large one. Sacramento layered on height limits and form standards so buildings still feel house scale. They limited parking requirements, and they included the ability to subdivide the units so they can actually be owned. The city basically said, if you help us hit our housing goals by building more front doors, we'll let you use more of the lot. Same tool as Portland, different package. And just like Portland, this isn't about banning big houses. It's about changing what's easiest to build next. So I'm sure you're asking, is it working? The short answer is it's early. Sacramento's ordinance is still young enough that most of the story is about permits and pipes, not finished blocks you can stroll on Google Street View. But the signal is clear. The city finally has a legal path to put multiple homes on lots that were locked into one. Small-scale, missing middle projects can, on paper, work better than a single McMansion. And planners are already adjusting as they see where the friction points are. The takeaway for Nashville isn't that we should import California's code wholesale. It's that another capital city in another growth market looked at the same housing ladder we have, saw the middle rung, and said, we're going to fix the incentives, not just the talking points. Prairie Queen, Portland, Sacramento, different scales, same idea. Reward buildings that match the neighborhood in form. Quietly tilt the math to more front doors in the same form and make the units saleable. So the question becomes, what would it look like in Nashville? On December 4th, 2025, after a year of studies and months of hearings, Metro Council voted to put the missing middle into the zoning code. To see why that matters and why the stretch between right now, as you're listening, and April 2026 is such a big deal, we have to rewind one more time. In 2024, Metro asked planning to do something our zoning code has basically never done. Look at the whole county and ask, if people keep moving here the way that they're moving here, how many homes do we actually need? The answer came back as a single blunt number. 90,000. 90,000 additional homes in the next 10 years just to keep up. When they went looking for where those homes might go, they found exactly what we've been circling this entire episode. Nashville is very good at producing two things: tall and skinnies on single-family lots and big apartment buildings on big streets and downtown. Everything in between, the townhouses and triplexes, the stuff that makes Prairie Queen and those Portland and Sacramento blocks work, the code's mostly shrugged. So planning came back with a 4-bill package. And in that December meeting, Metro Council passed 2 of them. First, a bill that creates new middle housing zoning districts, labeled RN and RL. And second, a bill that turns backyard units, or DADUs, into a real citywide tool. A third bill that addressed the height of buildings, and a fourth that addressed a voluntary attainability bonus for bigger projects is coming in early 2026. But for our story, the headline is simple. Nashville has now written the missing middle into law. Between December and April, we decide what to do with it. For 60 years, our zoning language had 2 basic words: single family and multifamily. A cute corner fourplex and a 200-unit tower both lived under the same multifamily name. RN and RL are Nashville's attempt to break the word apart and name the kind of buildings that we've been talking about all episode. Plex houses, small courtyard flats. Those live inside 2 new families of zones. The first is residential neighborhood, or RN. It's lower density, neighborhood scale stuff. The second is residential limited, RL. A notch up from RN, where you might see a little courtyard apartment or manor house. Now, the details between the two matter to the people drawing the maps, but for everyone else, the idea is simple. They're saying, here are the small buildings we've been missing. Here's where they can go, and here's how big they're allowed to be. Just as important is what didn't happen in December. Nobody's zoning changed automatically. Passing RN and RL did not flip any R lot on day one. Each individual property owner can pick their lot and file to rezone their lot. That means if you're a neighbor, you still get a postcard, planning still holds a hearing, and council still has to vote on the rezoning. Second is that overlays still win. So if you're in a historic overlay like Edge Hill, these new zoning codes do not trump it. And finally, there's no surprise nightlife. RN and RL don't secretly turn your block into a bar district. They're still fundamentally residential. The twist in the meeting came at the end. Council added an amendment that says RN and RL don't actually turn on until April of 2026. So between now and April, planners have homework. They have to create a community character manual, which is basically the city's picture book of what can go where. They also have to draft a county-wide picture of places that might be appropriate for RN and RL and bring it back to the council. So April 2026 becomes the pivot point. Until April, RN and RL are just words on paper. After April, they become lines on a map. And once they're on the map, they can become politics on your block. The second bill that passed is a bit smaller, but just as interesting. A second front door in your backyard. Detached accessory dwelling units, DADUs, have always been in the code. A few alleys in 12th South, a couple blocks in Cleveland Park, technically allowed and awkwardly regulated. This bill tries to move DADUs from zoning trivia to an everyday tool. So in plain English, in most of the urban core, a DADU is going to become a clear right for a property owner. And in the general services district, so the outer ring, like Bellevue, Antioch, Jolton, neighborhoods can now opt in instead of being told, sorry, that's only for the core. And the city did set some guardrails. The unit is small. It typically has to be a studio or 1 to 2 bedroom. It needs to stay shorter and smaller than the main house. It needs to match the main house in basic style and materials. And it sits behind the house. And then there's the part that everyone latched onto. On single family, RN or RL lots, where you build a new dadu. That dadu can't be your owner-occupied short-term rental. So this isn't an Airbnb in everybody's backyard. It's a small, permanent second home for a renter, a parent, a grown kid, or a little extra income. And just like RN and RL, dadus have a timer and a scorecard. By April 2027, planning has to report back on how many got built, where they landed, and what they did to things like parking and pipes. Around those two centerpieces are two more bills that shape the edges. The first is a height bill that would pull most R and RS zones down from 3 stories to something closer to 2.5. And second, a voluntary attainability bonus that says if you're building a larger apartment project and keep some of the homes at more attainable price points, you can earn small perks, a little more height here, a little less parking there. If RN, RL, and dadus are the tools, these two bills are the framework. They shape how big things feel on a street. And they add at least one small lever that ties new supply to who can actually afford to live there. So here's how this ties back to our whole story. As of December 2025, the tools are real. RN, RL, dadus, height caps, attainability bonuses, these aren't ideas anymore. Some exist in code. Somewhere in planning, they're already printed and tabbed. But tools don't change a city on their own. The real action is between now and April, when planners sit down with the community character manual and decide where the middle rung could go. When a draft of RN and RL maps show up at community meetings. When council members decide whether these new districts are a scalpel they're willing to use or a third rung they'd rather not touch. If you live in Nashville, this is a stretch where it stops being abstract. It's when you might see a line on a draft paper drift a block closer to your house. Where you realize that the corner lot you've driven past 1,000 times, next to the bus stop or the grocery store, suddenly has an option to be 4 smaller homes instead of 1 large one. Depending on where you sit, that might feel like a threat. Or like the first honest attempt to add the middle rung we've been talking about for 20 years. And that's where the tension of this whole series has been circling. For decades, Nashville relied on loopholes and HPR to add density without ever saying it out loud. Now, for the first time, we've written that conversation into code. Between now and April, we decide whether to use these tools to quietly recreate the old pattern or to finally build the middle that we've been missing. You've now heard 3 episodes on how Nashville was built. In episode 1, the state used procedure as a weapon. I-40 went through North Nashville. A community was destroyed. Not by one villain, but by a system that treated people as lines on a map. In episode 2, developers adapted that same mindset. They found one sentence in an old law, the Horizontal Property Act, and used it as a loophole. Tens of thousands of units later, we've got a city of tall and skinnies built not by conspiracy, but by incentives. And in episode 3, you've met the thing that we've been missing the whole time. The middle rung of the ladder. Once you see it, you start to see the levers. Missing middle is about directing development. It's about deciding what kind of growth you want. Right now, Nashville's growth pattern has been written by one loophole. That loophole made a specific building type, the 2-unit HPR, the most profitable thing to build on a standard lot. So that's what got built over and over and over again. But rules are not laws of physics, they can change. If you legalize different building types, cap the size of any one home, and aim our HPR tool at triplexes, fourplexes, and cottage courts. Then the system starts building something different. It doesn't mean build nothing or build everything. It's a false choice. The real question is, what do you want to build? You can have more neighbors and more trees. You can have more housing supply and character if the forms match the street. You can have growth and preservation if you decide which forms to protect and which to welcome. Directing development is not about saying no. It's about saying very clearly, here's what we want. Here are the rules to make it the path of the least resistance. So let's zoom all the way back down from zoning acronyms and case studies and loopholes to something simpler. Your street. Not your neighborhood name, your actual street. The one you drive down every day, the one where you wave at your neighbors or walk your dog or watch your kids ride a bike. What does your street look like? Is it the same as it was 10 years ago? Are there new buildings where old houses used to be? Have trees disappeared? Have prices doubled? Have longtime neighbors quietly moved away? Now ask yourself a harder question. Did you choose any of that? Did you ever vote on it? Did you ever attend a meeting about it? Did anyone explain the rules that made those changes the most profitable option? For most of us, the answer is no. The streets changed. We watched it happen. We didn't understand how. This series has been about the how. Underneath all of that is one question. What kind of city do you want to live in? Not Nashville as a brand, your Nashville. The place where you wake up, walk around, pay a mortgage or rent in. In 10 years, will your kids be able to afford to live here? Will your parents be able to age in place? Will your favorite coffee shops still have customers who can afford to live within walking distance? Will you still be here? Those aren't abstract questions. They're being decided right now. In rezoning bills, in overlays, in whether RN and RL become real options, in which building types we decide to make easy and which ones we decide to make hard. I'm not going to tell you what to think. The series wasn't about convincing you that HPRs are evil or the missing middle is some magic solution. You might listen to all of this and decide you're okay with the trade-offs we've made. That's a choice. Or you might decide that you want a different default. A city where a starter home isn't a $600,000 tall and skinny. A city where a teacher or a nurse can buy a 900 square foot place in the same neighborhood as their students or a songwriter. That's a choice too. But you can't make either choice if you don't understand the system. And now you do. Daniel Paralek grew up in Columbus, Nebraska, walking to bakeries and bagel shops in a town where density was just normal. He didn't think about it until he left and noticed what had disappeared everywhere else. Then he spent 20 plus years trying to bring it back. In drawings, in codes, in places like Prairie Queen, Sacramento. Nashville has its own version of that story. The state decided the highway. Developers decided how to use the HPR loophole. The city decided the zoning code. The next chapter, the one being written in Metro Council meetings and public comment periods right now, that one's up to you. Because now when someone says rezoning or missing middle or HPR, it's not just noise. It's a specific picture in your head of what might show up on your street. The only question left is the one that matters most. What do you want your street to look like? And are you willing to show up? To a meeting, to a vote, to a conversation with your council member to make it happen. This is Loophole City. Now you know how it works. What happens next is yours to decide.